Sachs. I'm outside looking for him, and he's already up here. Thanks, Jared. I'm Mark Sachs. This is Jared. We're going to talk about something a little different, which is Washington politics, and I know that just thrills everybody. This came up a couple of weeks ago when the White House released the results of their 60-day cyber review, which took 60 days to write and took another 45 days to get around to releasing. So there's interesting how this stuff works. The question then became, okay, how do we get involved? Jared on the list and I started talking about that and said, you know, we probably ought to do a quick talk on what goes on in Washington, how the carriers are involved, the ISPs and others, a little bit about what's behind the scenes. So that's what we're going to talk about today is just kind of how it works in D.C. and encourage any of you to please get involved and help us out. For those who have been watching, the Department of Homeland Security has been around about 6.5 years, opened up in early 2003. And a couple of years back, 2006 roughly, they released what's called the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, or the NIPP. The NIPP outlines, originally it was 17 critical infrastructures. They added an 18th one last year, the manufacturing sector. All of these sectors are asked to put together risk assessments, different types of plans. And so we have a group for IT, information technology, which Jared will talk about in just a moment, and a group for communications, the comms sector, which I'm a member of at Verizon. We all work very closely with DHS, the White House, and others. Most of us have pretty strong technical backgrounds. We've also made the mistake of making ourselves available to the government. And as soon as they realize that we can speak both languages, next thing you know, we're roped in and doing things for them. So the NIPP framework, I'm not going to go into the gory details. Please look online. The URL's at the bottom of the slide deck. You can download it and read it if you're having trouble sleeping. It's a great way to ease that pain and take it from there. But regardless, it's only 250 pages. You'll fall asleep very, very quickly. Inside the NIPP, though, they set up a partnership infrastructure, and they've asked that all the sectors create sector coordinating councils. These are organizations that it's an all-volunteer. Any company is free to join based on your sector. Representatives, if they're physically in Washington, is very helpful to be there. If you're not physically there, then you can participate through telecons or through trade associations or other ways to get involved. There's also a corresponding government coordinating council. This is largely DHS, but could also be Defense Department, Treasury, other agencies and departments that work with the different sectors. These two groups, these government coordinating councils and sector coordinating councils, work together to try and help Homeland Security understand what's going on in the private sector so that they can do what they need to do in terms of protecting the critical infrastructures. We all come together in a framework known as the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council, or CPAC. This framework allows us to share information between highly competitive companies outside of any antitrust, also allows us to share information with the government itself, and then they protect the information that we give them. It allows a two-way sharing. Now, there's a lot of issues we still need to work through. The government has a lot of information they would like to share with us, but can't because of classification requirements. Industry has lots of things we'd like to share with government, but are reluctant to, mainly because our lawyers won't let us. And I think all of you probably can feel the pain there. Let me let Jared talk just a moment about what the IT sector's been doing in this world, and I'll pick it back up again in a moment with the comm sector.
Yep. Hi. So when I first got sucked into this stuff, I didn't realize exactly what I was going into. I went into a ballroom in this hotel about 2 blocks from the White House that was filled about like this with different people. And when it ended up, there was a very small set of people, about as many as would sit maybe in 1 or 2 rows of tables here. And in some cases, it's just a very small set of people. And what's happened is, over the time, we've had these people from the private sector and the people from the government, and when they asked us all to come together and organize, it started with a room like this and ended up with a very small set of people. And the government was used to basically the private sector not showing up to a lot of these types of meetings. And the IT sector really took and said, look, we really need to do this right. And the IT sector really stepped up, I believe, and said, it's time that we go and we do this. And so the IT sector is very proud of the fact that they said, look, we're the first ones. We sat down jointly with the government. We wrote this sector-specific plan, which talks about it, a variety of different things. We spent a lot of time. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a meeting and said, no, really, these computer things, they're actually function-based. This isn't something where I need to secure my data. I'm going to put a security guard out front and protect my data. You know, we need to actually protect this from a function-based. If you want DNS to work, you know, you don't just go and say, okay, where's the 13 root name servers, and let's go and put a guy in front of them with a gun and say, we have now secured the root name servers. That's not the way you go and approach things. And this has been a continual challenge that we face. I mean, this is really something where we've harped on this for years and years and years, and a lot of great people have done this and advocated for that. We've gone and said, look, we've tried to set specific goals. We've tried to say there's a lot of best practices out there in this industry. I think a lot of people in here recognize that fact. You know, there's a lot of things that we wish that everyone across the industry could do. And one of our things we've tried to do is educate everyone on what those best practices are. And try and communicate to the government that, yes, we actually know what we're doing, and please don't come and regulate us, which I think is one of the big fears that I personally have in watching what's going on, because it seems that there's a growing impatience in the D.C. area with the rest of the country who apparently doesn't get it, but I guess the Hill does. And one of my things, I'd like to see more people like you guys here who are in this room show up with me to go and help spend some time explaining to these people what the industry is actually doing, and that we actually have smart people behind these things and are doing the right things, or trying to do the right things.
We're playing tag team, obviously. Let me talk a little more in depth about the communications sector and how we work. Many of us are quite familiar with it. We use this chart here. We built this for government so that the folks in government would have a better understanding. As you can see, in the middle is the core network. We use the typical cloud symbol, nice little drawings of little routers and switches, because everybody understands that. We don't try and map out what the networks look like. But what the two big takeaways that we want our government partners to understand is, when we talk about the communications sector, what most people think of is what we call the access. That's those things along the bottom, like wireless access through cell phones, internet access, broadband, video, AM, FM radio. In fact, the communications sector is more than just telephones and internets. We also pull in XM radio, any of the broadcast AM, FM, TV stations. That whole world is considered to be communications. Above that, we show the services, the big three: voice, video, data, and then try and break that down into the different types there. This very simplistic chart, we call it the pancake chart, is what we use in Washington when we're talking to the government officials about the communications sector. So we can point at different parts and say, okay, what we're talking about right now is this thing in this diagram. So that type of visual helps. You're free to use this if you need to for any of your own presentations. It's something that we've adopted over the last few years and seems to work when we're talking both technical as well as non-technical and policy people and others, just to have us all on the same sheet of music. Just a little background as to how we got here, because this didn't all just happen with Homeland Security. The communications sector's had a long-standing relationship with the federal government. In fact, if you go all the way back to our roots with telegraph, pre-Civil War, there's been a strong relationship between the private telegraph companies and the federal government, where the government did not ever want to take over the telegraph companies, wanted to let them compete individually, but they realized very quickly that, for example, in the Civil War, the North and the South, the Union and the Confederacy, could not move, could not communicate without using private telegraph lines. So there already had been sort of that understanding in place. As radio, television, internet, telephone, all the other new things came on board, that continued separation of the federal government not running the nation's communication infrastructure has continued to this day. That's not the same in most other countries. Most other countries have the comms infrastructure run by the federal government, although, to be fair, in the last several years, many countries now have started privatizing that and moving it out to let it be competitive. In the early 1960s, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy realized that that thing could not have been averted but for the fact that the United States communication infrastructure was linked to the Russian infrastructure, and the president could talk to Russia and work out the differences. They did realize, though, that inside the United States, the reliability wasn't always there for the president to reach out to the various cabinet members and to be able to actually run the government depending on a completely private communication system. So in 1963, they created what's called the National Communications System. This exists still today. It's headquartered in Washington. It used to be part of the Defense Department, but when DHS stood up, they moved it over to DHS. And it is what we call our sector-specific agency for the communications sector. They're an operational organization They track mostly circuit outages, satellite, undersea fiber optics, terrestrial fiber optics. They know pretty much what's going on around the nation in terms of the status of the networks. They have no insight into what the traffic is, though. They don't read email. They don't care about what people are doing online or what's going places. It's mostly just what's the status of the circuits. That's largely for the big, heavy government users like the Defense Department and others that depend on the private sector. In the early 1980s, another organization was stood up called the National Coordinating Center for Telecommunications, the NCC. This is co-located with the NCS, also at DHS, and very operationally focused. The creation of U.S. CERT a few years ago was a little at odds with this because the NCC used to sit in DOD, U.S. CERT sat at DHS. Today they've been brought together to where the U.S. CERT, while generally focused outwards across the entire nation, tends to look more inside the federal government in terms of the networking piece and working with the NCC that's looking out across the various carriers. We've also got some policy groups. The NSTAC, National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, is approximately 30 CEOs from the major carriers that are appointed by the president. They get reappointed when we get new presidents, or they get reappointed during an administration if the time runs out. They work directly with the president. In fact, back in May, we had an NSTAC meeting at the White House. President Obama met with those CEOs privately. It was a full day of interaction. During the year, there's an industry subcommittee that I'm part of from Verizon, and all the major carriers have people there, and we work high-level issues for the White House. Questions like resilience, status of undersea fiber optics, use of voice over IP, lots of interesting problems that come up. The Sector Coordinating Council, which we just mentioned a moment ago, is also one of our policy bodies. A little over 40 companies, and we're looking for anybody who would like to join. Anybody who feels that they're in the communications sector is absolutely willing or able to come in. So we meet quarterly, the Coordinating Council. We directly interface with Homeland Security and other stakeholders throughout the federal government. And our purpose is not operational. We're not watching circuits. It's mostly policy coordination. We want to make sure that Homeland and DOD and State Department, Treasury, and everybody else is well-versed on what we do in the comm sector. We are not a lobbyist group. We don't work with Congress. So make sure you understand that. We have no interest. Well, of course, we personally have interest, but the Sector Coordinating Council does not follow or track the bills that are in Congress. We have other groups to do that. Because of that, we work, many of us have security clearances. We work directly with the executive branch of the government. This year, there's a lot of priorities we're working on. Our sector-specific plan, long done, risk assessments are done. We're working very closely with the IT sector, making sure that we are completely coordinated. We participate in quite a few exercises and drills with the IT sector. We're making sure that our risk management processes are lined up. We are also developing metrics. This is something that's, as you probably are all very aware of, is hard to do. We can measure how many times we attend meetings. That's great. But how can we measure whether or not we are becoming more secure? Are what we're doing, is it making us more resilient? Are our COs better defended against some type of, say, truck bomb or something? We cannot avoid the backhoe attacks. That tends to happen, but we have to let the federal government understand that the likelihood of a backhoe cut on a fiber is much, much higher than some terrorist trying to blow up an undersea fiber optic cable. Once they get that perspective, then they can reallocate accordingly. As I mentioned earlier, we do a lot of coordination with the IT sector. Most of it is involvement in the various working groups. We all know each other. I am the representative from the comm sector to IT. We've got an IT representative that comes to comm sector. Most of our companies overlap so much. In fact, many of us have been talking about why don't we just combine together and become one sector. In most countries, it's done like that. It's called ICT. Here in the United States, we tend to keep it separated. The main reason behind that is regulatory. The comm sector is highly regulated by the FCC, as we have been since the 1930s. The IT sector, which is largely hardware, software type companies and some ISPs, is not regulated by the FCC. So if we bring them together, there is some danger there of regulation coming into those companies that are not currently regulated. That's an open for discussion matter, whether we should come together. We do, however, both organizations meet quarterly, and we do try and meet together once a year jointly, working on many of the same things. This, of course, is in the slide deck. These are URLs if you want to learn a little bit more about the comm sector, some of the history and the background. And of course, you can contact me if you'd like to know more. Let me turn it over to Jared to give you kind of the same overview for the IT side.
Yep. So the IT sector is, we finally stood up in 2006. after I think it was maybe a year and a half of sitting there and everyone convulsing through all the little technical and nitpicky policy things that they were worried about. We got together. We went from a room that was, like I said, I think it was this big or maybe even a little bit bigger when we had the launch, to just a very small meeting room in a hotel, where we decided that yes, we're going to finally organize ourselves and we're going to get with the program, because if we don't do it, the government is going to invent something for us. And we decided that we would rather play ball than have something be invented to be otherwise, because that really scares a lot of people in the industry. So we brought together all these people. We've defined a mission statement in the IT-SCC. It's something that's really important for us. The big questions for you guys here, I'm sure that you have for us, is why are you telling me about this IT thing? We're all service providers, or these or something else. There's this nice long list of people who are eligible to join the IT-SCC. And if you think that you're eligible to join, or you think that we left you out, you should tell us, because it'll provide you an effective opportunity to participate with us without going and feeling like you're out there trying to lobby the government. That's explicitly something that we're not set up to do. We're set up as a special not-for-profit corporation, actually, that cannot lobby the government. There's a section of the 501c, the 501 tax language that says, that you can't lobby the government. So we've got internet service providers, which includes backbone providers. We've got email providers. So people, I believe that Google recently applied to be a member. So Google does not only email but search and all sorts of other stuff. The DNS operators, GTLD operators. One of the things I see here that's missing from the list on the slides is storage providers, people who go and manufacture the equipment. But primarily here, I think any of you who are operating DNS or networks, which is hopefully most everyone in this room, you should have some sort of representation here, because when the government goes out and tries to do something like a risk analysis, they need good subject matter experts to be able to bounce questions off and bounce these theories off of. What if this happens? That's something that's happened for a while. The IT-SCC, it's important to maintain because, like Marcus mentioned, it's set up under the CPAC, which means, I believe amongst other things, we're protected from FOIA. So we can't get, you don't have to worry about the government or some reporter going and giving away your information. The slide deck I have has XX for percent for our representation of the sector, but it's certainly something where we would like to see that be 100% as opposed to a much smaller percentage here. We go and we try and provide a consolidated organization so that when the government reaches out, it has, as one of the people I know says, a belly button, something they can reach out and they can physically touch and say, you are the people who represent the industry as a whole. The SCC has a bunch of strategic objectives of, establishing this framework in partnership with the government. It works with this organization called the IT-ISAC, which is set up for doing information sharing and analysis, just like the communication sector has their own ISAC for doing that. We're trying to bring together, really the best people that we have out there in the industry. Establishing R&D priorities and other things. There's also things like, these protective programs, which, people naturally think of as setting up buffer zones around a building. How do you prevent, somebody from putting a truck full of explosives in front of a co-location facility and that type of stuff? There is some amount of physical aspect of this, but it's actually very limited in this area, because if someone takes out one facility, the internet will generally self-heal and route around that. There may be some limited loss, but not a lot. And we really try and collaborate with all the other people who are, are the SMEs in their field. We work very closely with Marcus and the comm sector. It's something where I see it as inevitable that the IT and the communication sector are going to be merged very soon. as I mentioned before, we try and do this function-based risk assessment, which is absolutely important. And we try and go and apply these methodologies consistently to try and come up with real things that we can actually take out of these, which is if we need to protect a root server, how do we go about that? A lot of people tend to spend a lot of time focusing on things like protecting the root servers when it's actually all the other name servers out there in the world that I think are far more interesting and should be protected much more rigorously than they are now. The IT-SCC have a number of things they've done. There was this thing called Project 12, which the government had set out as part of the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, and that was on just one of the projects on how can the government look at information sharing. It's something that's very hard to solve, and anyone who's tried to figure out how to share information between more than one organization where you've established an NDA, it's something that's incredibly complex to solve, but it's something that the government continues to strive to work together, and the private sector people continue to try and figure out how we can solve this problem. There's the IT-ISAC, which is the operational arm. That's not who I'm here representing. It's you can go out and join the IT-ISAC. I know it has a free membership tier. They also have some paid membership tiers. But they go and they try and set up a get this good the con ops, so they've got a good idea of what's going on and concept for all the operations and have a good idea of all that stuff. They also participate in exercises. The government goes out and tests things various different times to see what's your response. What if this happens? And those exercises like Cyberstorm have been very valuable for a number of organizations because they can test out their internal staff and see what they do in response to that. We continue to work with the Comm-SCC. We've got, this just mentions about how Marcus serves on the IT-SCC ex officio, so he doesn't have a vote or anything, but we continue to work together very closely. There's a lot more work to be done in R&D. I think there's a lot of space here where, as Paul was alluding to this morning, we need to be able to put the best and brightest minds together in how do we solve this network security threat. You've got all these guys out there who are trying to do really bad and nasty things to all of us, and we need to figure out some way to turn those tables, on the bad guys. And I really think that we need some sort of, huge leap forward to make that happen. There's Cyberstorm, like I said, the exercise where the government can test, not only their response, but the industry has an opportunity to come in and test their own responses. To join the IT-SCC, there are some minor membership requirements. It doesn't require any money, but you have to be able to commit to participate in a quarterly session twice a year. But you can do that via the phone. So you can just have one guy who puts it on speakerphone for about 8 hours. Oh, I'm sorry. There's quarterly meetings, but you have to attend two a year. Sorry. Yeah. It's hopefully more clear in the slides than I explained it. You need to participate in one working group, which means you're going to get some more email, but that's not too hard. And I really think that a lot of people here would be valuable in the risk assessment group. There's a communications and outreach working group. They go out and they try and recruit new members, like I'm doing here, hopefully. There's a plans and reports working group. They go and they deal with all the plans. The government has a plan for everything. Read the NIPP. I'm sure you'll get an idea of the scope of these things. It's certainly more fun than it seems, I hope. The Risk Assessment Committee, who goes and responds to the different analysis, we try and put together an entire picture of what the risks are for different parts of the sector. And there's the Information Committee of how can we effectively share information from one private sector to another as well as with the government. And there's all sorts of stuff here on this. There's the Metrics Committee, which I don't really know anything about, and the Protective Programs Committee, which is trying to do a number of different things to protect all the assets and infrastructure out there. And there's the R&D guys, which hopefully we can get some great innovations in this space to go and change this so it's more of an equal footing as far as defending our networks. There's the executive committee, which is responsible for all of these primary liaison roles with the government. They get together on teleconference a couple times a month in the IT side. I believe the next call is tonight. There's a variety of different ways that they've tried to divvy it up such that you can have the industry organizations in there, so your trade organizations. If you're represented through there, you may already in part be a member of the IT-SCC already. But we try and make sure that we have not only big people but small people participating in it. So we have some small companies. I believe one of the smallest has maybe 4 or 5 employees that's participating in IT-SCC. And that's something which I think is incredibly valuable. And we try and make sure that no one can sort of hog that space. It's well represented. If you decide you want to be a member, you can email these people. You can also come and talk to me, and I can go and get you the membership applications for that. You have to be approved, but it's really more of a smoke test of, are you really involved in the sector? And that's it. Questions?
So while we're lining up for questions, because I know there's going to be thousands of them, particularly with a break coming up, let me also point out that the other sectors do the same thing. We do a lot of work with the finance sector. We work with chemical. We work with the energy guys, electricity in particular, as the smart grid is starting to come of age. So it's not just us. There's a lot of this. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so this is mostly probably a question for Jared.
And your name and affiliation. Standard question.
So here's the question, and I'll bet a lot of people here are thinking this, but they don't want to say it. So, Jared, you're a smart guy, and you do networking stuff, and your network seems to work more or less. Why would you go talk to these government people? Like, what's the point? There's a lot of people like much higher level than all, because you were down in the nuts and bolts, and there's some useful stuff in there, but why should people in this room take any of that process seriously at all? What possible good things could come out of that?
I think there's 2 parts of it. Is that there's plenty of opportunity to actually interact with other smart people at other organizations, just in the same way that you have that here. That there's smart people who come from different service providers and different vendors come together. So you have opportunity to not only do that personal level networking, but also better meet everyone's business needs. And the other reason, honestly, is the internet space specifically has been unregulated for a long time. And I suspect that may not be something that is sustainable if the industry doesn't show up. And being the one tech guy in a lot of these conversations they come to when they ask and say, well, what happens to the internet if this happens? And there's 1 or 3 or 4 of us smart people who may be able to show up at one of these meetings. I can't cover it all myself. I need other smart people to come with me and to participate. And I've in the past recruited people like Patrick and Chris Morrow to come to these meetings, and I've seen them there. And that's been something that's been valuable, not only to help educate the government in this is what we're actually doing, but when they come in, some of these meetings, they invite the congressional staffers to attend. And they can understand, oh, wait, there's actually people who are doing something in response to this, as opposed to, oh, it's a bunch of industry people, and they're all out in the Bay Area, and they're running crazy and making all this money and all that stuff. It's something where, you can't just ignore this forever, and somebody needs to pay attention to it.
Next question.
Joel Yegley, Checkpoint. I'm not entirely clear on what the difference between frank discussion with the feds and lobbying them actually is. So perhaps you can speak
Yeah, let me
to
dig
that.
into that for a second. A lot of times when we think about lobbying, it's mostly working with a registered lobbyist, working with Congress, either directly with a member or with a member's staff. For example, Senator Rockefeller has put out this big bill on cybersecurity, so every company's out there trying to work with that staff to make sure that the language, should that bill become law, represents our interests. What the sector coordinating councils do, though, is not work with Congress. That's a different world. We don't work with the regulators like the FCC or the SCC or others. We're working with Homeland, DOD, White House, those that are really in the policy space, not the legislative or the regulatory world, so that they understand what the private sector is up to and try and pretty much put together this dream of having a true public-private partnership where private companies can work competitively and our government counterparts who have their own networks and their own responsibilities can understand what we're doing. Does that make sense? I guess so. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Ron Bonica. This morning, Paul Dixie told us about lots of smart people who leave their jobs swinging in the breeze while they go off and address security issues. It seems like an appropriate role of government would be to fund some of those people. Do you see any outreach from these groups to those folks for funding reasons?
Yeah, and you may want to jump in, but that's exactly the type of stuff we can get involved in if we can get that input from you and from other companies to come forward. So then we can play that right back to DHS, DOD, and others.
When folks want to go with their hand out for funding, which group should they go to?
Well, the federal government has lots of grants, so for those who already work in that world, we kind of know the process through the various grant organizers. Well, what's missing is what you're raising, and that is a need, that this is something that the country needs, so we can go back to the federal government and say, you know, we need to have some help here, so that and put some government tax dollars into it. That's not lobbying, by the way. That's working with the departments and agencies so they know how to spend our tax dollars.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Hi, Avi Friedman with Akamai. To get at Todd's point a little bit, I think it is important that over time the smart people from the operator community do play with the government people who are trying to figure out what's going on, what the actual situation is, because the scale at which the government plays and the technology with which they play doesn't give them a lot of real base to analyze when they hear things or to really see what's going on the internet and really understand what happens by accident, what could happen on purpose, what actually is happening, because they live behind a very firewalled world with different kinds of applications and different users. I had been involved in this community for a few years earlier this decade, and at the time I had the idealistic notion that the government could actually do some good at actually helping put pressure on some of the vulnerabilities that we've been talking about for 10 years, route filtering and address filtering and things like that. One thing that did disappoint me greatly was one of the really good ideas that I thought had come out of that whole process, which Mark had been involved in, was the government using its purchasing power to be able to say, we will only buy from people who do certain things, and it was instantly shot down by the lobbyists as soon as it was proposed. And so my response to Todd is I think it is important that some people on some rotation as basically a charity effort go and continue to provide clue so that Jared doesn't get stuck in this role. Second, my question is...
Thanks, by the way, thanks, Avi, because we need some peers. We need some help in D.C. So
I've already done it, so I'm not interested.
Yeah. No, we want you. We're going to recruit you to...
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk afterwards. But we'll find someone... Marty just joined Akamai. We can have him go do it. But, my question is, do you see any more hope now than 5-6 years ago to the idea that the government could have a constructive role in helping to not legislate, not go to regulation or, God help us, legislation, but actually have a constructive role in helping to get the internet more secure?
I think it'll work. I don't know what your thinking is, but there are good people in government who want this to work. One of the really awkward things we find, though, is once they really get good at it, the private sector buys them out. And we kind of have to start over again. And it's hard
has that happened to anyone in this room?
Yeah. No, everybody here is truth and loyal, right? But on the other hand, if you go back, even though you're in the private sector, you go back and work with the federal government and kind of help them, show them, work with them, almost a peer relationship. Even though you're not on their payroll, you're still providing that same type of insight as to what's going on.
It's just the question is the purpose of the outreach effort just mitigating bad things happening, or is there actually any hope of anything good happening?
There's a lot of threads. One of the main ones is that, particularly DHS, they want to do the right thing. We know how it's done. This is our world. It's what we live in. So by partnering with them, we can show at least the bureaucrat decision makers exactly what's going on, so there's no doubt about what the private sector's up to. help them with their decision-making process. Now, we cannot help the lobbying side, legislative side. That has kind of its own momentum, but at least from the executive branch, if they understand what the private sector is doing and what we do to protect ourselves, our own resilience, it helps them with their policy making, their decision making, and their oversight.
Good.
Thanks, Al.
Unfortunately, folks, we're going to have to cut it off here because we're out of time.
Oh, it is break time.
We're cutting into our break. So, Marcus, Jared, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Al.